Welcome back to Night Falls. Join me around the campfire tonight, and I'll tell you the story of how Luke and Sarah, two people looking for an escape in the Alps, crossed paths and found that sense of escape in one another. I can think of no better place to take stock than the Alps, where snow blankets the earth and quiets the chaos of daily life, allowing you peace enough to truly listen into your thoughts and feelings. Now, if you're feeling ready, tonight's story can begin. It was perfectly quiet. So quiet, you could hear a pin drop. The air was still, and the leaves and pines of the trees drooped down, sleeping until the evening breeze would come and stir them once again. The lakes and streams had frozen over months ago, so not even the trickling of water could be heard. And with nobody walking around to disturb the white canvas across the landscape, there wasn't even the sound of crunching snow underfoot to make a sound. There were barely any signs of life in this part of the Alps, making it an ideal location for tourists and holidaymakers who wanted to escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Log cabins of varying sizes were dotted across the mountainside, some hidden between the trees, whilst others laid in bare view of the elements, surrounded only by snow. Cabins varied from being clumped closer together with neighbours to being miles apart. There was a level of peaceful isolation to suit everyone. In the midst of the snow in a section of the mountain backed by trees, but open to the most stunning views on the other side, there were two solitary cabins. Each cabin was very different, but both were similar to each other in many ways. One was grand and modern, perfect for a family seeking luxury, and one was smaller and more simply made. It could only house one or two people seeking a more rustic experience. They may have been very different in their style and levels of luxury, but they both shared the most breathtaking views of nature. And in this tranquil setting, what more could you want? It was early in the morning on the 30th of December, about 6 a.m, and Sarah was already awake. Most people spent their vacations lying in bed as long as possible, but not Sarah. She had never slept better than she had at the cabin this past week, and as a result, she woke early every day, rejuvenated and ready to welcome the day from the first sight of the sunrise. She heated water on the stove and made herself a cup of piping hot tea. She would stand by the floor-to-ceiling window each morning, watching the sunrise over the snow-covered mountains in the distance. Observing the sun lazily creeping over the horizon each morning was comforting to Sarah. It was a simple view that brought peace and tranquility to her each day. Savouring this slow moment in her morning was making all the difference to her mindset for the rest of the day. She took more time to carry out her morning routine. She would slowly dress herself, taking note of how the soft materials brushed against her skin. She savoured brushing her long brown hair, enjoying how the bristles massaged her scalp as it passed over her head. She would cook her breakfast and eat slower, savouring every mouthful and noting each individual delicious taste. She felt calm and prepared for whatever the day might bring to her, which, at the moment, wasn't much. Her days in the cabin consisted of nothing much more than reading, bathing, eating, yoga, and watching the world go by. She had the most amazing outdoor bathtub on her balcony that she had relished taking long, steaming dips in whilst gazing out across the picturesque, snowy landscape around her. The icy air against her skin, mixed with the soothing warmth of the hot water, was electrifying and gave her more of an energy boost than any amount of coffee ever had. Her lifestyle here in the Alps was pure bliss. Back at home, she was the busy CEO of a company that she and a business partner had set up years ago. Her days consisted of copious meetings, important decision-making, and her email inbox pinging constantly. Started her days early and worked late into the evenings. Switching off and finding boundaries with her work was hard for Sarah. After all, the company relied on her, and it was a business venture that she had chosen to embark upon herself. She didn't dislike her job. In fact, she enjoyed it. But she did often wish for a bit more balance. So when the festive season had started approaching, she decided to make a change. Usually, she would spend the Christmas and New Year season working from home, even checking her emails on Christmas Day. But this year, she wanted to spend some time investing in herself and creating new healthy habits to get her well-being back on track. So, on the 23rd of December, she had set up the out-of-office automatic response on her emails, left everything in the capable hands of her executive assistant, and hopped on a plane to Switzerland. What better place to go to wind down and relax than one of the happiest countries in the world? For the first couple of days, she had struggled to switch off and had found herself reaching for her phone instinctively on more than one occasion. But by day 3, she had turned off her phone and placed it at the bottom of her suitcase, determined not to look at it for the rest of her trip. This morning, as Sarah gazed out of the large windows that lined the living room area of her cabin, she wondered whether it could be possible to always live life like this, without a care in the world, savouring each moment and taking everything at a much slower pace. Could she be truly content living life like this every day? Not too far away, hidden behind a smattering of trees, laid a smaller cabin. This cabin may have been much smaller than Sarah's, but what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in character. It looked just like it had been picked out of a storybook and placed amidst the Alps. Giant horizontal logs formed the walls of the cabin, and a large covered porch sat proudly out front. 2 rocking chairs rested underneath the canopy, and a simple garland made of holly hung on the front door. Inside, laid across a tattered sofa in front of a dwindling fire, was Luke. Luke had fallen asleep on the sofa the night prior, totally relaxed by the glow of the flickering fire and engrossed in his book. The open-plan kitchen and living area of Luke's cabin was about as big as the smallest bedroom in the luxury cabin across the way. But he had all he needed. He had a fridge, a stove, an oven, and a worktop and sink. He had a small round dining table and 2 chairs, and the comfortable sofa was placed perfectly in front of the huge stone fireplace. The fireplace was the real attraction of the cabin. To the left of the fireplace There were 2 doors to the bedroom and the bathroom. The walls were dotted with paintings of wildlife, and the mountains were lined with dim lights. A patchwork rug was spread across the wooden beam floors between the sofa and the fire. It was all very simple, but it was cozy, and exactly what Luke liked. Luke had always sought out a simple life. The idea of the rat race had never appealed to him, and he had happily remained in his hometown of Livingston, Montana. He loved working with his hands and had always had an interest in fixing things. So following in his father's footsteps to become a mechanic had seemed the obvious choice. Working 6 days a week had never been a problem for Luke. He liked his job, and he took it all at a pace that worked for him. Stress wasn't a part of his vocabulary. He was so laid back that everyone he met envied him. He shrugged off any inconveniences and appreciated the simpler things in life. So he never had any high expectations to meet. Luke was never happier than when he was on his own in nature. As a keen hiker and nature lover, the prospect of a festive season in the Alps had seemed perfect. It was unlikely that they would see much snow in Livingston this year, and Luke couldn't bear the thought of another busy festive season, attending parties and family gatherings, making small talk with people he only saw once a year. It had been a busy year with work, so Luke had packed up his rucksack and headed out to his small cabin in the Alps for a festive season that he would actually enjoy. Every day, he would take a hike before finding his way to the local shop to buy some food and wine for the evening. He would go out and chop his own wood for the fire, and then return to the cabin to nap on the rocking chair on his porch. He would finish the day by cooking a delicious meal before reading by the fire with a glass of wine in hand. It was a simple routine, but it suited Luke just fine. On the 30th of December, Luke stirred from his resting place on the sofa and headed out into the frosty wilderness to gather more firewood. The world felt oddly quiet today. Usually he could hear the faint chirping of birds in the trees or the rushing of mountain wind in his ears. But today, all was still. Even the snow felt softer than normal, and his boots only faintly brushed against the powdery snowflakes as he walked. He didn't even leave prints behind him. He chopped fresh wood from the stump he had been using this past week and began his journey back to the cabin. Meanwhile, from her luxury cabin close by, Sarah pondered on her plan for New Year. Usually, she would be sipping champagne with friends from the rooftop bar of a skyscraper building and gushing about how she was going to conquer the world this next year. But this time around, there would be no celebrations. She had no idea what she would strive for this next year. Her priorities felt like they had shifted recently. Overcome by the prospect of a new year on her own, she decided to draw herself a bath on the balcony. She always felt her worries melt away in the bath. She watched as steam cascaded up into the fresh air as hot water gushed into the tub. Wrapped up in a fluffy robe and slippers, Sarah poured a few drops of essential oils in with the water. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the luscious scents of eucalyptus and lavender clear her airways. Her whole body felt overwhelmed with a feeling of calm, and all her muscles felt like they were loosening. Once the bath was full, She stepped in and nestled herself into the tub of warm, scented water. Her body floated as if it were resting on a cozy cloud, and she gazed out at the incredible views from her balcony. The snowy mountains rose up high ahead in the distance, and the midday sun beamed brightly down on her. A cool breeze began to pick up, and she felt it caress her nose and cheeks as she lay submerged in the bathtub. She lay there for a while, doing nothing except focusing on breathing in and out. She was totally relaxed. After a while, she heard the soft fluttering of wings and opened her eyes to spy a tiny robin that had landed on the balcony beam in front of her. She opened her eyes and smiled at the sweet bird as it ruffled its feathers and pranced along the beam. As she followed it with her eyes, she caught a glimpse of a figure walking in the distance. She sat up a bit higher in the tub and looked out into the snow. It was a man. He was dressed in a full snowsuit and boots, properly prepared for the weather conditions, and he was carrying a pile of wooden logs. He looked very much like a classic lumberjack, even down to his rugged, dark beard. He appeared to be tall, and the closer he got, Sarah noted that he was quite handsome. She wondered who this mystery man was, so close to her cabin. The man's eyes suddenly lifted up and looked straight at Sarah's balcony, catching her eye. She ducked down into the bathtub quickly, embarrassed that he might have noticed her watching him. After a few moments, she slowly peeped out over the side of the tub to see if he was still looking, but his attention was elsewhere now. He seemed to be heading towards the trees to the right-hand side of her cabin. She hadn't left her place to go exploring so far in her getaway, so she had no idea if anyone lived nearby. She even had her food and wood for the fire delivered to her door, so she had no need to venture out into the snowy wilderness like this man. She was very intrigued as to who he was and where he had come from. Meanwhile, Luke trudged through the snow, past the huge cabin, into the trees, and found his way back to his own abode. He nudged open the front door and laid the fresh wood by the side of the fireplace. He recalled the woman he had seen on the balcony of the large cabin. As he restarted the fire, he wondered how this woman would be celebrating her new year. The next morning, Sarah awoke at the break of dawn, as had become routine for her. She made her usual cup of tea and watched the sun rise. Today was New Year's Eve, the 31st of December. Tomorrow will be the start of a new year and a new reality as she prepared to go home. But today, nothing else mattered. She decided to make the most of the day and step foot outside of her cabin for the first time in over a week. After spotting the handsome lumberjack walking through the snow yesterday, she had felt inspired to take a walk herself. Sarah dressed herself in her warmest clothes, her biggest coat and her snow boots, and headed out into the wild. She knew there was a little store and cafe somewhere nearby. She would pick up a bottle of champagne to enjoy at midnight, even if it was only for herself. She walked across the snow for about an hour before she finally came upon the little store. and little it was. She browsed the shelves, but there was no sign of any bottles of champagne. Sarah sighed and shrugged her shoulders. Wine, it would have to be instead. She scanned the labels of the wine on the shelves, but none of the names rang a bell. She inspected each of the labels closer before asking the shopkeeper which wine he recommended. A husky male voice replied, "I personally recommend the Gamma Ray." She turned around and came face to face with a dark-haired, bearded man, wearing a checkered jacket and snow-covered boots. His icy blue eyes were friendly, and he had a warmth about him. He looked familiar to Sarah. He reached forward, took a bottle of Gamma Ray off the shelf, and held it out in front of her. "If you like red wine, this is a great one," he continued. "It's similar to a Pinot Noir, but is darker and has a spicy kick." She smiled and took the bottle of wine from his hand. "You know your wine?" Sarah commented, tipping her head in thanks. "No, I just drink a lot of it," he joked as he took a bottle of the Gamma Ray for himself. That's when it clicked. This was the man she had seen walking through the snow the day before. Sarah paid for her wine, while Luke continued to browse the shop. He picked up the daily paper and a couple of cans of soup before queuing up behind her. She hoped that he didn't recognize her from when their eyes met yesterday. She must have looked so pretentious, sat in a bathtub on a balcony, even if it was the most relaxing thing she had ever experienced. With her bottle of wine bagged up, she moved next door into the cafe and ordered a cup of coffee to go. She looked over her shoulder for the mysterious lumberjack and spotted him talking to a man outside the front of the cafe. They were laughing as if they were old friends catching up. Perhaps he lived here, she thought. With her coffee in hand, Sarah set out to make the journey back to her cabin. The hot liquid warmed her insides, while the winter cold swarmed around her. She looked over her shoulder and saw the mystery lumberjack walking down the hillside, further away to the right. "I promise, I'm not following you," he called out to her. "My cabin is down this way." "My cabin is this way too," she called out into the expanse. "Care to join me for the walk down?" Luke paused for a moment, thought, and then began striding towards her. "Why not?" He smiled at her warmly. The pair introduced themselves and then continued to walk down the hillside together. They started by making polite small talk, but quickly fell into a comfortable rhythm of back and forth, sharing their travel stories with one another and a bit of backstory to each of their lives. It seemed they had both had the same intentions with their trip to the Alps. They were both in search of some peace and quiet, and a break from everything and everyone at home. Despite their differences, they appeared to be kindred spirits. They eventually arrived outside the front of Sarah's luxurious cabin. She thanked Luke for his company and felt a little bit disappointed that their meeting was about to end. Luke took a closer look at her cabin and whistled in awe. "So you're the lucky person staying here," he remarked, raising his eyebrows and looking up at the wall of glass windows. Sarah smiled self-consciously and shrugged her shoulders. She was aware that the cabin was much bigger than she needed, and she worried that Luke might judge her for splurging. But instead, he smiled at her and reassured her by saying, "You must work hard to be so successful. It's impressive. She was grateful for his kind words. Not many people were so complimentary. At midnight on New Year's Eve, apparently if you look out to the left of the mountains, you can see fireworks coming from the hotel, Luke informed her, gesturing into the distance. Sarah's eyes widened, and she looked out to the area Luke had gestured to. Luke opened his mouth to speak, and then hesitated. "What were you going to say?" Sarah giggled, noticing his hesitancy. Luke thought for a few seconds, and then decided to say what was on his mind. "If you're interested and want some company tonight, you're welcome to come to my cabin to share my bottle of wine," he suggested sheepishly. Sarah's heart seemed to skip a beat, and she felt her cheeks blush. Spending New Year's Eve on our own would be quite bleak, wouldn't it? Sarah chuckled softly. Luke pointed out where she could find his cabin, and they arranged to meet later that evening after dinner. That evening, Sarah spent more time than she cared to admit getting ready to go over to Luke's cabin. She didn't know why she was putting in so much effort for this stranger she had just met, but there was something about him that made her want to impress him. Unbeknownst to Sarah, Luke was thinking exactly the same thing. As soon as he had returned to his cabin after their walk, he had set to work tidying up, decanting the wine and lighting as many candles around the cabin as he could. He had put on his nice shirt and jeans initially, but then opted for more comfortable clothing of a jumper and a pair of joggers. He didn't want to come across too keen. Perhaps she wouldn't come. Sarah was staying in such an extravagant cabin. Why would she want to spend time with a stranger in this small, simple place? When he eventually heard a knock at the door, Luke's mood instantly lifted, and he opened the door to Sarah standing there in her warm coat and snow boots, holding up her bottle of wine. Sarah, too, had opted for a cozy woolly jumper and soft black leggings with fluffy socks for the evening. Luke's nerves eased as soon as she stepped foot inside. They were both so comfortable in each other's presence, and there were no pretenses between them. They settled down on either end of the sofa in front of the crackling fire and shared the bottle of wine. Sarah told him all about her life back in New York City, her penthouse apartment, her thriving company, and her family holidays to Bora Bora every year. Meanwhile, Luke described his life in Montana, his work as a mechanic, and the exploits of each of his 4 brothers and their children. They laughed at each other's funny anecdotes and listened with encouragement to one another's hopes and dreams. They were from separate worlds with different experiences and priorities, but they shared an understanding of each other and complemented each other's individuality. They were like chalk and cheese, but also a match made in heaven. As it drew closer to midnight, Luke suggested they move outside onto the porch to catch the fireworks. They put their coats and boots back on and sat out in the rocking chairs on the porch. Luke had been concerned that Sarah wouldn't approve of his simple cabin, but she loved it. She declared that it was far cozier and homier than the luxurious pad she was staying in. They swayed back and forth in their rocking chairs, watching as more snow began to lightly fall from the night sky. So, on New Year's Eve, I always like to ask people what their wish is for the next year, Sarah declared. setting down her wine glass in her lap. "So Luke, what is your New Year's wish?" Luke thought hard. What was his wish for the next year? To work less days of the week, or to earn more money? To learn a new skill or travel more? Maybe even meet the woman of his dreams? He eventually came up with an answer. "I think my New Year's wish is for this year to be the most exciting one yet. I've been stuck in a rut, and I'm ready for new possibilities and adventures." Sarah nodded in approval. "I like that wish," she said. "And what is your wish?" Luke asked her back. Sarah looked into the dancing flames and answered wistfully, "My wish for this next year is that I will take more time to relax every day, to continue to enjoy long mornings before work, watching the sunrise, no matter whether I'm here in the Alps or back in New York City." Luke smiled and assured her that it was a good wish and she should make it happen. Sarah knew it would be a difficult adjustment at first, but she knew it would make the world of difference to her daily life. All of a sudden, they heard a faint popping sound far off in the distance. They looked out to the sky and saw balls of multicolored light exploding in the air and shimmering their way back down to the earth. The firework display had begun, and Luke had been right. They had a perfect view from here. "Happy New Year," Luke cheered, raising his glass in a toast to Sarah. Then out of the blue, Sarah leant forward, held the back of Luke's head, and pulled him closer to place a soft kiss on his lips. "Happy New Year," she whispered. Luke smiled in surprise and watched her as she leant back in her rocking chair and gazed out at the ensuing firework display in the distance. His heart fluttered and he melted into his chair. Perhaps he would welcome in a new year full of possibilities, after all. In the crisp silence, you would almost swear you could hear a snowflake drop, planting itself amongst the billions of other intricately formed ice particles. Maybe, if you closed your eyes and really focused, you would expect to hear the muffled hum of far-off chalets, restaurants, or resorts. Or perhaps you would listen for the shuffling and crunching of snow underfoot as a bird lands on the ground or a fox slinks by. You could try to search for all these sounds, but you would probably fail to find them. Here, on this slope in the Swiss Alps, it is perfectly peaceful and surreptitiously silent. It is also breathtakingly beautiful. Jagged grey mountaintops border the landscape, creating a separation between the white, snowy ground and the pale sky. Snow-dusted pine trees climb up the sides of the sprawling mountains, adding texture to this blank canvas of wilderness. When the wind blows hard enough, flurries of snowflakes can be seen floating on the breeze above the ground, like shimmers of magic moving through the air. If you watch the land for long enough, you might be fortunate enough to witness some of the breathtaking animals that call this wintry wilderness their home. You might see the great golden eagle soaring through the sky, or the lumbering brown bear guiding its young through the snow. If you're really lucky, you might catch sight of the white mountain hare hopping from place to place, camouflaging excellently within its habitat. And there's nothing quite like seeing the magnificent antlers of a stag as it emerges from within the trees and trots across the open land to find its herd. Thousands of holidaymakers swoop upon the ski resorts and chalets each year, longing to find their own place in this wilderness, escaping from the hustle and bustle of their normal lives for the quiet wonderland of the Alps. In one particular cabin, nestled on its own quiet slope, two holidaymakers had returned to enjoy the blissful peace and romantic scenery that the Alps provided. The log cabin was quaint, guarded around the back by a swarm of pine trees and open at the front so that from the wooden porch you could admire the view of the natural landscape for miles. Sarah nestled herself into the rocking chair on the cabin porch and wrapped herself in a thick blanket. The steam from her mug of coffee floated wispily up into the air, creating swirls and patterns of white in front of her face. The air was crisp and dry. As Sarah took a deep breath in through her nose, she felt her whole body lift with invigoration from the fresh, clean oxygen. The scent of pine needles hung in the air, and a tinge of smoke from the cabin chimney tickled her nose. The landscape ahead of her was peaceful and serene. There were no vehicles, no passers-by, and no other cabins in sight. She felt totally alone in the wilderness. It was what had attracted her to the area in the first place. Last year, the Swiss Alps had called her name, inviting her to relax, recharge, and recenter herself in the solitary confines of her luxurious cabin. The spontaneous solo trip changed her life in many ways. She had been forced to slow down and disconnect from her bustling life in New York City, and learnt to savor the small things, to take note of the simple, wonderful things that we experience every day, but are too busy and distracted to properly process. A year on from her last trip to the Alps, Sarah no longer woke begrudgingly to the chiming of an irritating alarm. Instead, she naturally woke to the sunrise and welcomed it with open arms. Every morning, she made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window in her bedroom, watching the sun gracefully appear over the top of the New York skyline. She would use this quiet time to daydream and sometimes to write in a journal. She would eat her breakfast slowly and delight in the textures and tastes of her food, feeling gratitude for every single bite. Only when she felt like she had enjoyed a suitable amount of time acclimatizing to the new day would she dress herself and head to work or start her activities for the day. Aside from her gentle morning routine, Sarah had brought home several other things from the Alps. A new sense of purpose, a refreshed set of priorities, and a partner to go through it all with. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, swallowed and sighed with a smile. She heard the front door to the cabin open, and she glanced over her shoulder to see Luke peeking his head around the doorframe. "Good morning," he greeted her in his soft, gravelly voice. Luke looked a little dishevelled from his grey woolly jumper, tartan pyjama trousers, and fluffy slippers. His dark hair was ruffled from sleep, and his bushy beard needed a comb. His eyes were heavy, and he yawned slightly as he greeted her. Sarah suppressed a giggle. He looked a far cry from the appealing, tough lumberjack persona he usually presented, but still appeared just as ruggedly handsome as always. A year had passed since Sarah and Luke's chance encounter in the Alps, and ever since their kiss on New Year's Eve last year, they had been almost inseparable. Despite the fact that Sarah lived in New York and Luke hailed from Livingston in Montana, they had made their relationship work. They each took turns regularly flying across the country to spend time with each other, and technology certainly made keeping in touch easier these days. Luke had experienced Sarah's high-flying life in New York and enjoyed exploring the city with her. Whenever she went to work and returned home from the office, he would be waiting in her penthouse apartment with a home-cooked meal ready for her. They would eat and drink together, taking in the amazing views of the Manhattan skyline from the huge glass windows that bordered her apartment. It was a luxurious side to their relationship that they relished, and Sarah appreciated Luke sharing it all with her. Then, when Sarah flew over to his home in Livingston, they experienced a different side to their relationship. In Montana, they led a slower and simpler lifestyle, but it was full of moments that they both treasured in a different way to New York. Sarah had met Luke's family, his many brothers, and their children several times over the course of the year. Whenever the family got together, the place was wild with chatter and laughter, and Luke and Sarah barely had a moment to themselves. But when they returned to Luke's charming small house at the end of a long day, they happily slunk back into their comfortable, intimate routine. No matter whether they were in New York, Livingston, or apart, things were always easy between them. They didn't have to be busy to enjoy each other's presence. They shared a contented companionability. They had each found their soulmate in the other. To mark their first year together, Luke and Sarah had decided to return to the cabin in the Alps where they had first got to know each other and shared their first kiss. It was here, on this very cabin porch, that Sarah had plucked up the courage to kiss Luke. It was heartwarmingly nostalgic for them both to think back to a year ago and reflect on how their relationship had developed since then. They were very much in love with one another. Luke had slept in that morning after they had spent a late night playing board games together, but he was up now and ready to take on the day. They had no plans except to enjoy each other's company in their little cozy log cabin, looking out on the dazzling Alps. They discussed making breakfast, and Sarah told Luke that they were almost out of wood for the fire. He raised his eyebrows and said that they would have to go chop some more together. Sarah grimaced at the suggestion. The last time she had vacationed in the Alps, in her luxury cabin, she had ordered chopped wood to be brought to her door. She had never chopped wood for herself. Luke decided this was the perfect opportunity for her to learn a new life skill. He threw on his coat and hat, slipped on his boots, and stepped out onto the porch. He ushered Sarah to follow, and she reluctantly followed him out into the snow. Luke led the way around the back of the cabin and into a clearing in the woodland where a few tree stumps and a whole load of piles of wood were littered around. An axe was placed to the side of one of the stumps, and Luke picked it up and held it out to Sarah. She stared at his outstretched hand and protested that she wasn't strong enough to chop wood. But Luke wouldn't acknowledge her excuses. She would never know unless she tried, he pointed out. Luke instructed her to grab a few blocks of wood and bring them over to one of the tree stumps. He stood one of the pieces of wood upright on the stump and touched the axe's tip to the top of it. Then he swung the axe back just enough and brought it back down on the wood, chopping it cleanly in half. He made it look so easy after years of practice, but Sarah watched on, intimidated. Grabbing another piece of wood and balancing it on the stump, Luke guided Sarah through the process. As she clasped the axe with both of her hands, he gently held his on top of hers and helped her chop the wood in half. At first, Sarah was nervous, but after a few goes with Luke's assistance, she felt confident enough to try it on her own. The moment when she brought the axe down on the wood and watched it split in two with a crack was satisfying. Sarah could now say that she knew how to fetch her own firewood. They gathered up enough logs to fill their arms and carried it all back to the cabin, where they rekindled the fire and cooked breakfast. The couple made their daily journey up the mountain to the little shop to gather groceries. It was in this little shop, next to the cafe, that they both originally met. When Sarah had been looking for a bottle of champagne to enjoy on New Year's Eve, she had been left with only wine as an option. Luckily, Luke was nearby to recommend her the bottle of Gamay, and as a result, they went from strangers to acquaintances. It wasn't long before they became more than that when they discovered the cabins they were staying in were close to each other. Revisiting the shop now, Luke and Sarah stocked up on snacks and a couple of extra bottles of Gamay for their cabin. It had, unsurprisingly, become their drink of choice. Once they had gathered everything they wanted and paid, they nipped next door into the cafe. It was quiet in the cafe. It wasn't a very busy spot on the mountain to begin with, and, in the late morning, people were more likely to be hitting the ski slopes than the eateries. Luke and Sarah ordered a couple of hot chocolates and sat by the window, overlooking the mountainside. They had a clear view of the slopes from here, and they watched as little black dots in the distance zoomed across the pristine white landscape. Sarah took a sip of her hot chocolate and sighed. She hadn't been skiing in years, but she had many fond memories of skiing holidays with her family when she was younger. Despite the regularity of snow where Luke came from, he had never been skiing himself. It had never interested him very much. Referring to the skiers in the distance, Sarah asked Luke, "Would you like to try it?" Luke shook his head and scrunched up his face. The idea didn't appeal to him. He was perfectly content with his feet firmly on the ground without sliding around. Sarah pouted childishly and insisted that he should try it at least once. If he wanted, she could be his teacher. But Luke firmly declined her offer with a laugh. Sarah watched the skiers glide around effortlessly, weaving in and out of one another, leaving tracks in the snow. She recalled how good it felt to feel the icy air against her face as she soared down the slopes. Skiing was both exhilarating and calming all at once. When she got into the flow, she felt like she was flying. She wished that Luke could know what that felt like. Then she had a thought. She had a card still to play. Sarah cocked her eyebrow and pointed out to Luke that she had had a go at trying something new today by helping chop the firewood. Perhaps he should try something new for her too. Luke rolled his eyes and sighed. She had in there. Later that afternoon, Luke and Sarah headed to the ski hire shop and rented a pair of skis each, helmets and boots. Then they bought a day pass to hit the slopes. Sarah wondered if Luke was nervous, but he seemed perfectly calm. Maybe he was just good at hiding it. Since it was Luke's first time, they took it easy and headed to the nursery slopes where he could practice his balance. They had a good giggle to begin with, as Luke attempted to put his skis on and repeatedly lost his balance. However, he persevered and eventually got the hang of staying upright as he pushed himself along. Sarah taught him how to snowplow, to slow himself down, and then they tried a few runs back and forth along the nursery slopes. While children whizzed past them on their little skis, Luke and Sarah stuck to a slow pace, gradually building up Luke's confidence. Despite his initial unease on his feet, Luke picked it all up quickly, and it wasn't long before they progressed onto the next slope up for a bit more of a challenge. Sarah was patient as she taught Luke, and he was an open and positive student. They had a great time. They laughed at their mistakes and they cheered at their successes. They worked together to figure things out, and by the time they needed to head back down the mountain before sunset, Luke and Sarah were able to ski side by side down the ski road and back to base. Sarah was right. As Luke slid down the ski road, navigating his turns well and allowing his skis to pick up some speed, he felt the air rush through his hair and revitalize his skin. It was surprisingly enjoyable. Sarah skied ahead a little, and Luke watched her glide across the snow like a dancer. She was an impressive woman, and she made him very happy. Luke counted his blessings that he had met Sarah here in the Alps just a year before. With their ski gear returned and the sun setting beyond the mountain, Sarah and Luke made the journey back to their cabin. They trudged up the snowy verge in their heavy boots, tracing the edge of the trees that lined the hill, and admired the glowing orange sun emanating its last beams across the land. With every step, their feet sunk down into the thick, crumbling snow, leaving behind a trail of footprints. Luke's large, clumping boots looked like bear paws in the snow compared to Sarah's petite feet. Finally, at the top of the hill and back at their cabin, Sarah and Luke were exhausted and slumped down on the sofa in a heap. The fire had gone out, but the cabin was still warm and toasty, a welcome comparison to the bitter cold outside. Melting into each other's arms, they both closed their eyes in companionable silence and drifted off to sleep together. When their eyes eventually opened, the blanket of night had wrapped itself around their cabin, and the moon was crescent in the sky. A stream of stars glistened in the heavens, and not a sound could be heard across the land. Sarah gazed out the window and enjoyed the tranquil view with a glass of wine in hand, while Luke lit the fire again. Sarah's eyes drifted momentarily from the outside world to the inside of their little cabin, and she smiled. Years ago, she would have turned her nose up at the idea of spending a week in a tiny, rustic log cabin in the Alps, rather than a luxurious lodge or chalet. But Luke had mellowed her and helped her learn to appreciate the simpler things in life. In fact, nowadays, Sarah much preferred the likes of their little cabin in comparison to the elaborate, expansive lodge she stayed in last year. But the main difference that made the quaint cabin all the more special was the special man she got to share it with. Luke had opened her mind and her heart to a different way of living and loving. Sarah now found that the superficial things in life didn't bring her anywhere near as much joy and satisfaction as the humbler things did. Lazy mornings in bed with Luke, barbecues in backyards with family and friends, feeling Luke's hand in hers as they walked down the street, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. These were the kind of things that made Sarah happy now. Whenever Luke visited her in New York and then had to leave and return to Montana, Sarah began counting down the days until they would be reunited again. But even though they had both gone their separate ways from their respective cabins in the Alps a year before, the Alps had brought them back together again. They couldn't keep away from each other. Luke, Sarah, and the Alps. Their time together might not be limitless, but Sarah had a feeling that they would always return to each other, no matter how far apart they might be. She turned her attention back to the wilderness outside the window with a content heart. Meanwhile, Luke encouraged the flames in the fireplace to grow and warmed his hands against the heat. He glanced over at Sarah and smiled. She looked so relaxed and blissful in comparison to how he felt. A whirlwind was rushing around his head and his heart wouldn't stop beating hard in his chest. He tapped his pocket to check there was still something in it, and he sighed with relief as he felt the delicate object beneath the material of his joggers. He sat down next to the fireplace and grabbed his own glass of wine. He referred to the large box by his side and asked, "You want to play this board game?" Sarah smiled and eagerly moved away from the window to sit opposite him. They set up the game and chose their coloured pieces, placing them on the start line. They loved playing board games together, and tonight they planned to enjoy a classic game of trivia to settle down for the evening. As the fire crackled and heated up the room, Luke and Sarah rolled the dice, answered the trivia questions, and moved their counters around the board, all while enjoying a bottle of Gamma Ray. Luke purposefully allowed Sarah to speed ahead, collecting all of the coloured wedges she needed to head back towards the finishing hub to win the game. Sarah giddily rolled the dice and clapped her hands with excitement as she rolled a 4 and placed her counter in the final hub. She grinned and asked Luke to give her her final question. If she answered correctly, she won the game. Luke felt like his heart might explode out of his chest, and he wiped his moist palms on his sides. He was nervous to pose this final question to her. He took a deep breath, and instead of reaching for a card out of the trivia deck, Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold ring with a circular diamond in the center. He held the ring in front of him and moved so that he was now bending down on one knee. Sarah almost dropped her glass. She was so surprised. She stared at Luke with wide eyes and a gaping open mouth as Luke posed the final question of the game to Sarah. "Sarah, will you make me the happiest man in the world and marry me?" he asked. With sparkling tears in her eyes, Sarah took a deep breath and whispered back a yes. It was the easiest question she had had to answer all night. Sarah held out her left hand, and Luke slid the twinkling ring onto her fourth finger. He clasped her hand in his, gently interlocking their fingers, and they both leaned in to share a long kiss. The proposal might have been a surprise to Sarah, but the intention of spending the rest of their lives together wasn't. They'd both known for a long time that they were each other's soulmates. "What a night," Sarah commented with a giggle. "I went Trivial Pursuit and I got engaged." Luke laughed softly and gazed into her eyes. He gushed with happiness. "You may have won the board game, but I won really. I get to spend the rest of my life with you, and for that, I am incredibly lucky." Sarah kissed him again, and they both held each other, never wanting to let go. It seemed that every time Luke and Sarah spent time in this cabin, their lives changed for the better. It was here that they had first fallen for each other, and it was here that they had realized that they never wanted to be apart again. The Alps really had a magical way of putting things into perspective, and Luke Mark and Sarah now knew, more than anything, that their futures lay solidly with each other.